Greetings, everyone. My name is Dr. Jay Singh, and I'm the founder of Publication Academy, your online training partner for higher ed career advancement and professional development. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today for this installment of our Career Pathway series, Exiting Academia. Today, we have a fascinating interview with Dr. Zach King, who successfully transitioned from completing a PhD in sociology into the exciting industry vertical of banking. So let's get right into it. Over now to our amazing Publication Academy interviewer, Dr. Gertrude Nantra.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to chat with you today. What's your PhD in and what do you currently do?
Hi, Gertrude. So I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. My PhD was in sociology, and now I'm a UX researcher. I currently work for Citibank.
That's amazing. So UX researcher with Citibank. Mm-hmm. How did you go from your PhD to being a UX researcher in Citibank? I feel like a lot of PhDs who get in touch with me, even graduate students, want to do something like that. But one of the challenges is, how do I get from here to there? So can you talk us a little bit through that journey?
Absolutely. Well, like most people who get their PhD, my goal when I set out was to get a job in academia. To get a professorship somewhere and be able to teach. I love teaching, but it didn't quite work out. Part of that is that it's hard to get one of those positions when you're tied to a location. So my girlfriend, who I live with, she's a computer science professor, and we moved to New York where she got a position as a professor. And so I tried to seek out every academic position I could out here, but for sociology, it just wasn't panning out. And part of that is that I don't have a strong publication record. I was working and teaching all through grad school, so I only have a couple of publications to my name. And I've been working ever since then. A lot of that time I've been working in restaurants and bartending. And with those kinds of schedules, it can be tough to keep up, to create publications, to do research. So I was searching for all kinds of things. I felt kind of lost out here, away from my friends, big city, new life. And I was trying to figure out what kind of job I might be able to do other than academia or serving and bartending. I have some background in UX design. I've always done art. I've always done creative stuff. I used to do graphic design and then app UX design before grad school. And so I was thinking, maybe I'm a designer. Maybe I'm an artist. One of my dream jobs would be to do like art for video games. I was looking into like character design, but I'm so behind on the technical skills of like 3D sculpting. I am brushing up now. But all that said, I was searching and trying to figure out what would my role be. Very disorganized job search, right? It's very hard to find a job if you're trying to apply to like 3 different, very discrete areas. Eventually, I started seeing these positions that called for UX researchers, and I didn't know what that was. I knew what UX design was, but I'd never heard of a UX researcher. So I started looking into these job postings and seeing that many of them specified that they were looking for sociologists. And the pay was decent. I was very surprised that there were companies willing to pay sociologists decently. My whole family had always told me that as a sociologist, I'm never going to make very much money. And, it's New York City. I'm not making great money now, given the cost of living here, but it's decent. And it's definitely easier than life as a server bartender. So that's how I ended up here.
Right. Absolutely. So basically you never even really worked in academia as a postdoc or even as a professor. You just went from here to there. That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And so what do you think is in your background as a sociologist specifically that makes you so attractive to companies for UX research? What, because yes, we understand. And okay, maybe even before we get there, define what UX research is and how sociologists are just perfect for that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I guess first I'll say that not every company would think that a sociologist is perfect for the role necessarily. It really depends on the hiring manager and their experience with academia. I think some lean really heavily towards they want you to have a business background or a technical background. A lot are designers, right? And so that they have that background. And many people in industry didn't go to grad school and aren't familiar with what it means to go to school for sociology. I still get asked at work quite often what a sociologist is. So there are some that would value it, and there are some positions that specifically mention it in the role description. But yeah, there's plenty of people that aren't really familiar with what it is. I would say that a sociologist is quite good for a UX research role, if I do say so myself. Definitely biased. But the reason I'd say that is because a UX researcher is someone whose job is to do research that supports the creation of designs that work for people, right? So you need to be able to gather information from people, from the users of products. You need to be able to gather information about larger social trends. In my role specifically, right, I'm not just a UX tester. I'm not just putting designs in front of people and walking them through them. It's also not just limited to then on top of that doing quantitative work, A/B tests and survey research. I'm also a strategist. So I'm looking at larger social trends. I'm looking at attitudes. I'm looking at the competitive landscape and what's happening with different industries. What are the emerging technologies? And all of this is stuff that, a sociologist is expected to do. Study society, understand what's going on from the macro level down to the micro level, down to interpersonal interactions and having a meaningful one-on-one conversation. I think being able to draw insights from macro and micro and have those constantly speaking to each other makes for a really good UX researcher, somebody who can add a lot to a team.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Now, so I think you touched on it a little bit when you were saying, this is why a sociologist may be good for this role is you're looking at society at a macro level and at a micro level, and you're using those insights to inform the research that goes on and then to inform the usability of a product or whatever it is that you work with, right?
Yep.
So for somebody who is currently, maybe in academia who wants to move into this, what skills would you say have been most transferable or that you've leaned into a lot? I know from talking with others, for instance, a PhD's ability to learn things quickly is always going to come in handy. I found that, a lot of people have found that, but what do you think are some of those skills that have really been helpful with your job?
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably the most useful skill day to day that allows me to excel and to bring a lot of value to the projects that I work on is the ability to construct the right approach, the right methodological approach, right? To be able to think in kind of a more rigorous scientific way, right? Not to put too much of an emphasis on the positivist side of it, but just to be able to think through, like, how are we going to be able to ask this question in a way that's going to get a result that's appropriate? Or, when I'm going into a user test, what is it about this user testing session that is going to actually approximate a user's real experience? Where is there going to be a disconnect between the method that I'm limited to and the situation that I'm trying to then generalize my results to? How can we account for that difference? How can we construct the interview and the interaction in a way to try and get at the insight we're looking for, even though a method is always imperfect? And it's those kinds of, I think, questions and like seeing those problematics and being able to come up with a practical solution to them. I think that that's really valuable. And I think that any sociologist has probably gone through that in the course of doing their graduate work, in the course of designing their own studies, right? Trying to figure out, well, how am I going to get data in a data collection method that is going to be the most appropriate to what I want to apply it to? And I think it's that tension, right? That trying to make our work useful and really grappling with like complicated problems that are difficult to create a really tangible solution to. When you're then put in an industry position where many of the problems are actually less complex than you might have been working on when you were doing your graduate studies. Yeah, I think that those skills can really, really come in handy. I think that there's a lot of limiting aspects. There's a lot of limiting things we learned in grad school that make it hard for us to excel in industry too. But I think that's a skill that would help us.
Absolutely. So, oh, I wanna talk about that. The limiting things in grad school that could cause us to be unsuccessful in industry. What's one of those things?
So the one that I encounter most often that I think is really not a barrier, because I mean people are still succeeding, but definitely something that is an area that many people could improve on when we come from an academic background. Even people that don't, but I think that some of these bad habits are particularly strong among academics. And I would say that communicating in a way that other people can easily understand and having respect for other people's own ways of communicating, that, you know, having the, I guess, one way to put it is sort of like the humility to be able to accept that explaining my research in a very complex, like technically complex way, or paying attention to every detail of the methodology, and basically just kind of like showing all of my knowledge in every presentation that I give about a piece of research is not necessarily the best way to communicate. It's not necessarily better. There's a lot of ways that I feel like I was taught to speak and present myself in academia that were geared towards sort of a performance of academic intelligence that don't lend themselves to good practical conversation with people outside of academia. And this isn't limited to industry. I mean, this has been one of my main frustrations with academia, right? Even as a researcher, it felt very difficult to make my work useful because there was so much pressure to conform my research and my language and the way that I conducted and presented all of it to fit in to the academic standard, to a culture that places a lot of emphasis on elitism in many ways, and a certain language of what counts as sounding professional or intelligent, right? Yeah, is often exclusionary, is often not accessible to people outside of academia. So I had that frustration then. And then in industry, I realized that even though I had that frustration, I still carried a lot of those habits. Like,
Right.
even though I'd attempted, like my dissertation, I tried to write it in really accessible language. You know, my friends have always been non-academics. My family, no one in my family went to graduate school or anything like that. So I've always tried to like keep grounded in other cultural spaces and other ways of speaking and being understood. But industry reminded me that, yeah, I've carried a lot of those habits where I'm just putting way too many words on a given slide. I'm using way too much fancy jargon when I try to explain what I did and why.
Right.
Yeah, and so when I get past that, when I'm able to like push myself to really like get to the point, explain things in plain language, you know, in language that's accessible to whoever I'm speaking with, that's more familiar to them. When I push myself to do that, I get a lot more support from the folks I'm talking to. I get a lot more interest in the research that I've produced and interest in trying to make changes based on that research.
Whew, so many good things you said there. And I remember I was telling this to somebody recently because the person would say, well, how do I was an academic and had been a tenured professor before. And I think the question was, well, how do I get to express my ideas? I think he had started a blog or newsletter and he was hoping that it would reach more lay people, right?
Yeah.
More
Yeah.
non-technical people. And so I had taken a look at his writing and I'm like, well, that's because you're talking above them. You know, and you may not realize it because you're so used to writing that way or speaking that way that you don't realize that there are people that don't live in that world. There are people that they're very, very intelligent people, but they don't speak the way you're speaking. They don't use those same words. You have to use the words people use. So I remember giving that piece of advice, and I can definitely see how that can be a challenge. That hasn't been a challenge for me personally, just because the way that I learn, the only way that I learn is by breaking everything down to the simplest of components.
Yeah.
And that's the way I understand things. And if I don't understand it, I literally cannot write it.
Right.
So even in graduate school, when there was a complex topic, I couldn't write about the complex topic until I understood. And I think maybe this is also a limiting thing for me, but until I stood it and I understood it at its barest of bones, I'm like, I can't talk about that, right? But then on the flip side, like you said, we can get sucked up too much into that world and begin to think everybody speaks like this and miss the mark. So thank you for sharing that, because I think that's a real struggle.
Yeah, thank you for sharing about your experience too. I mean, I feel like that sounds like the greatest strength to be able to take these complex ideas, break them down into the simplest terms that you can, almost like reducing a fraction, right?
Right.
I feel like that is exactly it. That's the key to being able to take a complex idea, figure out, well, what's really the core mechanism of this? And once you've got that allows you to attempt to translate it into different spaces, different ways that people speak. And I also appreciate that you emphasize that it's not that any group of people outside of academia is less intelligent. And I do think that is a bias academics carry. But I absolutely think that intelligence is distributed probably fairly evenly across social classes, academic spaces, but it's just society's so rife with these hierarchies that emphasize that try to spread myths or set certain standards for, like, you're only intelligent if you talk like X thing that's been constructed by power, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Absolutely. No. So thank you for sharing that. That was really intriguing. When you were speaking, it was just like, I'm kind of the opposite. Like I could not do the jargon. Like whenever I went into seminars, like there was a talk, somebody was giving a talk. The only talks I remembered are the ones where the people just like made it simple. The ones where they were like, I don't know whether they were trying to impress or really sound academic. I remember nothing. And I think that's a disservice, right? Yeah. That's a disservice to everybody when nobody can understand what you're saying. Like, what's the point? You know? So anyway, thank you. I just had to chip that in there.
Of course. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. So for somebody that, I think you've said a lot, Zach, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise and sharing what a UX researcher does and how your background fits into that and some of the challenges you may even have faced getting there. So I have a question here. Are you still involved in academia in any way? Because I think that's one of the questions where people are like, I will lose my academic skills if I work outside of academia. Maybe, should I like take on an adjunct teaching position or maybe stay involved in academia some way? My thinking on this subject, Zach, is that I think it's historically, it's been like academia exists as a mutually exclusive entity and then industries on this side. But in my mind, actually, a lot of the time, industry, because I work in the biotech industry now, and we use a lot of the academic ideas to develop the things we're developing.
Sure.
So there is that marriage, there is that fusion, but for some reason, we don't seem to see it as that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I heard a couple questions there. One was more about whether I'm still involved in academia, and then the other being how academia could be actually more involved in our industry lives than we might assume. As for my own involvement, so before I entered into UX research, I actually did do some really wonderful teaching positions. I had a really great lecturer position at Metro State in Minneapolis, and I loved that. I really miss teaching. That's what I don't miss academia as much as I miss teaching. So that's one piece. And then another piece is that I very much care about all the subjects that I devoted myself to as an academic. They're still critically important to me. Questions of power and ecology and politics and social change. I care about them, but I'm not sure that I ever was very involved in those issues as an academic. Even in graduate school, I was more involved in grassroots community organizing around those issues. And I think that still, I feel like I contribute more by speaking to those spaces rather than academic spaces. I after all my years in graduate school, I was never sold on the value of taking my theorizing and analysis into academic spaces and and hashing out those conversations there versus creating art or accessible text, sharing it widely on the internet through social networks and things like that. That's where I've seen an impact that I value, or in my community, right? Meeting people and trying to organize and build community power. So I've never really, I'm not the one to ask, I guess, about being still involved in academia, because I never really was the star academic, but teaching, I love. Talking about these ideas, I love, especially outside of academic spaces. As far as the involvement of academia in industry, yeah, I think that there's a ton of potential for crossover there, for sure. In my current position, we do sometimes look to academic research to inform certain projects, like when I'm working on investment projects, for instance. I have to be careful about what I say because most of it's confidential, but to not be specific, we'll look into academic literature on how investors have been broadly understood, how other academics have approached sorting out different kinds of investors, for example, different kinds of investing behavior, how we've measured things like financial literacy, right? And the sorts of things that have informed those measures. So yeah, there's a lot of that. And then I think that I see people having success, like going to conferences that are more industry focused, but also where there might be a lot of crossover with academic folks. And I also see a lot of people increasingly now that are kind of like already getting into applied or industry research when they're in graduate school. So there's already sort of like more of that bent. My program wasn't like that. My program, I didn't know that applied or industry work for sociologists existed. But
This is yeah, no, this is really helpful in helping people think about that, and if you still want to be involved with academic side of things, that there is opportunity. So thank you so much, Zach. This has been such a great conversation. I really appreciate you for being here.
Thank you. No, I really appreciate it. And I loved hearing your thoughts too. Thank you for making this time.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.